Hey folks, in this video we are going to be learning how to automate data collection from Google Sheets using Google Apps Script by using the Google Sheets ID in order to collect your data. I have a previous video, which I'm calling a level 1 way to automate data, where we use the get sheet by name function in order to call the name of individual spreadsheet tabs. The problem with this method is that if the spreadsheet name changes, your code will break. So, for example, we are collecting data from this Google Sheet and we are pulling from the short data tab and we are pulling it into this automating data pull sheet into sheet 1. So what I'm going to do is demonstrate how this can break down. So let's say that you automated the data pull sheet for someone else and you gave it to them with the name sheet 1 and they decided to change it to summary data. When we go into our data extractor script and we hit run, or if we scheduled this for a daily pull, you'll see that it's no longer working. And the reason for that is because the destination endpoint that we declared is sheet 1. And it is no longer called sheet 1, it's now called summary data. So the way that you would go about fixing this is either telling people do not change the name, or by going into your script like I just did and manually changing the name of the sheet in order to get the data to automate the pull. So a more efficient way, a more robust way to do it is by referencing the sheet ID. So Google Sheets has a value called a GID, which represents every sheet in the spreadsheet. So when you create a new spreadsheet, it will always have sheet 1 will always have the value of 0. So when we go to our sample data sheet, you can see, or workbook, you can see we have a value of 0 in here. And then we have a different value for the long data sheet and a different value for the lookups sheet. So what we're going to accomplish today is we are going to construct two functions. One is called opener, which will allow us to open the spreadsheet that we want to reference so we don't have to write spreadsheet app every time. And then we're going to create a function called get sheet by ID so that we can reference the workbook ID as well as the sheet ID in order to automate our data collection so that we don't have to worry about people changing names and breaking our scripts and forcing us to take manual action. So we're going to be moving kind of fast today, but we're going to begin by creating a spreadsheet, and I'm calling mine level 2 automation. We're going to go into extensions and we're going to open up app script, and we're going to have a fresh script for us to write our code into. So I am going to update my project and I'm going to call it level 2 automation. And I'm going to start creating reference points. So I'm going to start collecting my spreadsheet, my workbook ID, and my spreadsheet IDs. So I'm going to begin by creating a const for source workbook, and then I am going to create a const for sheet 1 ID, and I can enter it in as 0. And then I am going to also create a const for long data ID. And I don't have anything for that yet, so I will just leave it as is and I'll go back. And then I'm going to write some notes here, or some documentation to myself that says that this is the destination endpoint. And I am going to create a const for dest workbook, which stands for destination. And then I'm going to put those in there. So now I'm going to go collect my IDs. So I'm going to go into the source workbook and I'm going to go to my long data tab. That way I have my spreadsheet ID up there and my workbook ID. So I'm going to begin by collecting the workbook ID from the URL. I'm going to go back to my script. I'm going to paste it in there. And then I'm going to go to my long data ID and I am going to collect that value from the end of that tab. And now I'm going to go to my destination endpoint, which is level 2 automation, and I will be collecting this workbook ID. And for now, I only have sheet 1 ID, so I can reuse this constant up here for both workbooks. So if I want to collect data from sheet 1 or I want to send data to sheet 1, I can do so. The difference is, though, that in my source workbook, sheet 1 is not called sheet 1. So I'm going to say source has name of short data. That way I just kind of have a note that says for sheet 1. That way I know. And then long data is just its own thing. Cool. So now what we're going to do is we are going to create a function. So we're going to begin by writing the word function, and then you can name it whatever you want to. I am going to call it opener. And I am going to create 2 curly braces, and I'm going to write some notes about it. I'm going to say this function opens Google Sheets workbooks by ID. And what I'm going to do now is I am going to type in spreadsheet app, open by ID. And what I am going to do now is I am going to pass in workbook ID, and I am going to say return. So all I want to do is create a function that allows me to pass in a workbook ID that will then return spreadsheet.openById. That way, instead of having to type out spreadsheet.openById multiple times, I can just type opener, and that will take care of it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a function, and I'm going to call it getSheetById. And I'm not going to pass in the parameters or the arguments yet because I want to show you how it works. So the first thing that I'm going to do is use the opener function to open the Google Sheets workbook. So I'm going to call a variable, and I am going to name it WB, which will stand for workbook. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call that opener function that I just created. And now what this will allow me to do, you can see my argument is in there. It says workbook and then any. The problem with this is that it doesn't have a type hint. So ideally what I would say is that the type hint is string, so that if somebody externally needed to use this, they would understand that the string goes in here. But for our purposes, we're the only ones using it right now. We need to pass a string, and it needs to be in the format of our constants up here. But what we're going to do for now is I'm just going to pass in my source workbook ID. So this is going to make this static, but this will allow us to see how this function works. So now that we have our workbook, we're going to create a variable for sheets. And we're going to say workbook.getSheets. And it's right there. And now what we're going to do is we are going to use logger.log sheets. And what you're going to see is, and we have to give it permission, so we're going to hit save, and then we're going to run. And it will eventually ask us to allow it to read and write to our spreadsheets. Go to advanced, go to level 2. All this is fine as long as you're the one creating the script, as we talked about. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run get sheet by ID, and what this should say is sheet, 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 sheet. And that stands for sheet, 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 sheet from our source workbook. So what we have to do is we have to iterate through that array in order to see what the sheets are that exist in that workbook. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a for loop. So now we're going to loop through the sheets, and we're going to say for I in sheets, and then we are going to do sheets I dot get sheet name, and we are going to log that so that you can see what happens when you do this. And now you can see we're getting short data, long data, lookups, list of names. So when we go back here, check it out. Short data, long data, lookup, list of names. We've now successfully looped through our source data workbook and returned the names of the sheets. So now what we want to do is we want to kind of like reverse engineer the get sheet by name function, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to say if sheets iterable dot get sheet ID is equal to, let's use sheet 1 ID. Then we want to get the sheet name. So I'm going to delete logger.log. I'm going to delete this extra parentheses there. I'm going to copy our code. And actually, you know what? I'm going to undo what I just did, and I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to delete it, and then I'm going to put it in between our brackets here. And we are going to run this. And what should happen is we are saying if sheets iterator.getSheetID equals sheet1 ID. So if any of those sheets equals 0, we're going to return that name. So we're going to run this, and now we get short data. Love to see that. So now what we're going to do is instead of saying sheet1 ID, we're going to say long data ID, and we're going to run it. And now we got long data. So what we're going to do now is we're going to change short data in here into random sheet name. And we're going to go back in here, and we're going to change this back to, and you don't have to do this, I'm just showing you what's happening here, just so that you kind of understand what's happening, is now it's returning random sheet name. So before, our script would break if the name changed, but now our sheet is flexibly moving with whatever the sheet name is because we have the constant of the Google Sheet ID, which will remain unchanged unless they delete the workbook. But for our purposes, that will not happen, because if they delete the workbook, then we're not going to have a project to work on to begin with. So what we're going to do now, and sorry about my little, there we go. Stop following me. Okay, let's try that again. Cool. So now what I'm going to do is, instead of logging that, I am going to turn this into a variable, and I'm going to call it sheet name. So I'm going to call var sheet name equals sheets iterator dot get sheet name. So now we can get outside of our loop, and we can call that workbook dot get sheet by name. And instead of passing in a static string like sheet1 or long data or random sheet name, we're now going to pass in our dynamic variable sheet name, which will respond to whatever name is in the sheet. So we're going to return this, and what will happen now is we will be able to access the workbook by using the getSheetById function, and then we're going to be able to pass in a workbook name and then a sheet ID, and then we can either extract data or send data depending upon the action that we want to take. So last thing that we have to do in here is we need to remove these static variables, and we are going to replace them with some arguments. So I'm going to name it sheet ID, and then in my opener function, I'm going to call workbook ID. And these are basically just placeholders. You can use whatever you want to here. You could literally type in X, you could type in Y. I like to give them names so that when they pop up, I know what I have to pass in there. So same way that opener returns spreadsheet.openById, and then it needs a workbook ID to successfully execute. The same thing's happening here, where now we're doing workbook get sheet by name, and then we are returning it, which is very similar to when we go back to our level 1 script in here. You can see that's basically what we're doing, right? So we're doing spreadsheet.openById, and then we're passing it a workbook ID. And then in order to get the actual sheet where we either want to read the data or we want to send the data, we're then saying get sheet by name, and then we're passing in a static value. The two functions that we've created in here, the get sheet by ID and the opener ID, eliminate the need for that. That's effectively what they do. So now what we can do is we can create a third function, and we can call it data collector. And we don't need to pass any variables or arguments to it. What we're going to do now is we are going to say, what are we going to do? Let's call it source. Let's actually spell it right. Var source equals, and then we're going to call get sheet by ID. And what we can do now is we can pass in our source workbook ID, and then let's pull from sheet 1 ID first, right? And we are going to now create a variable called data. And we are going to call our source variable, and then we are going to get range, and we are going to start at row 1, column 1, and then we're going to reference source dot get last row. And then we are going to call source dot get last column. And then we are going to get display values. And now we've collected our source data. So we're going to call logger.log, and we're going to log our data. And what you should see is, we have an invalid ID in there on lines 12 and 17. So we have... I'm sorry. I didn't change the function up here. So now we're going to change it to data collector. And we're going to run that. My apologies. And now you can see, look, we got all this data in here. And what's even cooler about it is that if we wanted to, we could just dynamically change this. And now we could call long data ID. And then check it out. We got all the data from the long data tab. So let's go back to sheet 1 ID just because. And now what we're going to do is we are going to replicate the code from our original data extractor. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a destination, and we're going to call it whatever sheet we want to in level sheet 1. Cool. So what we'll do is call our destination, and we will do get sheet by ID again. Oh, sorry. Destination endpoints, and we're going to call var destination, and we will get sheet by ID, and we will call what is it? Destination workbook. Yep, destination workbook is our destination endpoint. We're going to be sending this to sheet 1, and we are going to call our endpoint variable, and then we will call destination dot get range, and we will do 1. Oh, you know what? We don't have to even call variable. We can just call destination because we use get sheet by ID. So now what we're going to do is we are going to send the data, So we're going to do destination 1, 1, and then we need to get the source dot get last row and source dot get last column. And the reason that we have to do this is because we need to have an equal amount of rows coming from our data to the endpoint that we send the data. So what happens is if we did destination get last row, there's no data in there currently. So it would just return a 0. So by referencing source.getLastRow, we're getting the number of rows in the data that we need to then send into our destination sheet. Same thing with our last columns. So then we're going to set values, and we are going to pass in data. And now we are going to cross our fingers and hope that we successfully compile our script. So now we'll go back into level 2 automation and check it out. We got some data in there. But as we recall from our first video, if we then, so let's say we wanted to do long data ID, right? So we run this data and we go into our sheet, and now we can see it's updated, right? When we go to the bottom of this, it's nearly 1,300 rows of data that we just sent in here, right? So if we then shifted to the short data and we ran this, you're going to see that this data up here updates, but all this data stays, right? Because there's 1,300 rows compared to 30 rows in short data, or now it's known as random sheet name. So what we need to do is we need to clear the data before we send it. And there might be better ways to manage this. This is just personally how I've always done it. So we're going to use destination.getRange. We're going to do row 1, column 1, and then we're going to do destination.getMax rows. And the reason that we have to do get max rows is because we need to now reference how many rows exist in the destination sheet. If we did get last row from the data source, that would do the exact same thing as sending it. So like, for example, sheet 1 ID has 30 rows, long data has 1,300 rows. If you reference the data coming from sheet 1 ID, the last row will be 30. If you then transition to long data, the last row will be 1,300. So what you need to reference is the maximum number of rows in the destination worksheet, clear it out, and then send in the amount of data that you need to send in. So now we're going to use destination.getMaxColumns, and then we are going to use the clear function. So what should happen now is we should hit run, and let's see if it compiles. It does. And you can see now all the data leaves the environment. And now we have 30 rows of data, which is exactly what we want. And then we can go in here and we can switch this to, oops, sorry, no caps, long data ID. We can run it. And what will happen is you'll see this will clear out, and then it will immediately send in the long data. Or at least it should. Maybe we got an error. Oh, we got an error in here. Interesting. What happened here? Line 38, destination. Oh, the issue was I put it into the... I am so sorry. That was such a silly mistake. Look at this. So this is because we were trying to send it to long data. The source is where I should have changed that. So now we change this. Hit run. Go to our spreadsheet. Should all clear out. Boom, long data's in there. Now we're back in business. Great. So the last step is automating this now. So we can go to the triggers tab. We can add a trigger, and we are going to set it to be time driven. And we could do hour, we could do day, we could do week, we could do month. I'm going to do hour. and I am going to set this to update every hour. You could also set it to update every 2 hours, 4, 6, 8, you name it. It's all in here, right? We're going to do an hour timer. So basically every hour this workbook will update. I won't have to do anything, and everybody will be really happy because I automated data for them, or data collection for them. Cool. So to go over what we learned today, we learned to reinforce a vulnerability in our level 1 automation because of the getSheetByName function being susceptible to error if the name of the tab changes. Additionally, we learned how to create functions so that we don't have to rewrite lines of code over and over again, right? So when we go into our script here, we created the opener function that takes one argument, which is a workbook ID that comes from the URL of the source or the destination that we want to collect or send data. We then use the opener function within our getSheetByID function that took two arguments, being the workbook ID for the opener function and the sheet ID, showing the worksheet that we either want to collect data from or send data to. That results in us collecting a sheet name so that we can programmatically reference the getSheetByName function in the event that an individual changes their sheet name. Our code will not be impacted. Finally, we created a function called DataCollector that enabled us to use the getSheetByID function in order to pass in a workbook ID and a sheet ID so that we could collect data and then send data to a destination. The last thing we did was use the Google Apps Script trigger in order to set an hourly trigger so that our script automatically runs every single hour so that we don't have to. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm always interested in feedback, so please feel free to use the comments section. I have other videos on my channel that talk about developing solutions within Google Sheets and Google Apps Script. I hope you'll check it out, and I wish you the best of luck on your data journey.